The throne room was deadly quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. David, the Alpha King, stood with his back rigid, his jaw set in stone. He had expected her to scream. He had prepared for her to shatter, to drop to her knees and beg him to reconsider the brutal words he had just spoken in front of the entire assembly. I, David Vance, Alpha King, reject you, Lisa, as my mate. But Lisa didn't move. She didn't gasp. Her eyes, usually so expressive, were twin pools of still water. She looked at him, really looked at him, for 3 agonizing seconds. Then she simply nodded once, turned, and walked toward the heavy oak doors. She accepted his rejection, without crying. And as the heavy doors clicked shut behind her, David realized with a sudden, suffocating terror that her absolute silence was going to break him far worse than any tears ever could. The air in the grand hall of the Obsidian Pack estate tasted of ancient polished wood, expensive wine, and simmering anxiety. Tonight was the Winter Solstice Gala, a mandatory display of wealth, power, and unity. For David Vance, the newly crowned Alpha King of the Unified Territories, it was a test. He wore his tailored charcoal suit like armor. Every smile he offered to the visiting alphas, every nod of acknowledgement to the murmuring elders, felt like a calculated chess move. He was 28, brilliant, ruthlessly efficient, and currently profoundly irritated. His inner circle stood nearby, nursing crystal tumblers of scotch. Marcus, his beta and oldest friend, watched David's rigid posture. "You look like you're preparing for a firing squad, not a party," Marcus murmured, stepping close enough so the hovering dignitaries couldn't hear. David didn't look at him. His gaze was locked on the grand staircase. "The elders are circling, Marcus. They want to know when I'm choosing a Luna. They think without a queen, the alliances are fragile." "They are fragile," Marcus pointed out sensibly. "And they're not wrong. A mate stabilizes the king." "A mate is a vulnerability," David countered, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made a nearby waiter flinch. David had seen what love did to men. He had watched his own father, the previous king, make disastrous tactical decisions to protect a fragile Luna. David had vowed long ago his reign would be built on logic, strength, and unbreakable alliances, not the fickle, chaotic whim of a fated bond. If the moon goddess paired him, he would deal with it strategically, politically. Then, the murmuring in the hall died down. At the top of the sweeping mahogany staircase stood Lisa. David's breath stopped in his chest. It wasn't a gasp. It was a sudden, violent halting of his lungs. Lisa wasn't royalty. She was the daughter of the Pack's lead archivist, a quiet girl who spent her days in the dusty, lower levels of the estate, cataloging Pack history. David knew her peripherally. She was always polite, always blending into the background. Tonight, she was not blending in. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that clung to her curves and moved like liquid when she stepped. Her dark hair was swept up, revealing the delicate column of her neck, but it wasn't the dress. The moment their eyes locked across the cavernous room, a scent hit David with the force of a physical blow. Vanilla, rain-soaked earth, and something electric. The scent of his mate. His wolf slammed against the cage of his ribs, roaring in a possessive, primal frenzy. "Mate, ours." David gripped his glass so hard the crystal groaned. He saw the exact moment it hit her, too. Lisa froze halfway down the stairs. Her hand tightened on the banister. Her eyes, a striking, clear hazel, widened. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and exquisite. No, David thought. a cold dread washing over his logical mind. Not her, not a commoner, not an archivist. The political ramifications flashed through his brain in a millisecond. The elders wanted him to mate with Lady Genevieve of the Northern Wastes to secure the iron trade. They would never accept a mousy archivist as their Luna. She had no power, no territory to offer, no political leverage. She was exactly the kind of vulnerability he had sworn to avoid. He saw Lisa take a tentative breath, a small, hopeful light blooming in her eyes as she began to descend the remaining stairs. Her gaze fixed solely on him. She was walking toward him, drawn by the invisible, magnetic pull of the bond. David set his glass down on a passing tray. His jaw clenched so tightly, his teeth ached. He had to kill this before it breathed. He had to sever it in front of everyone, so there would be no whispers, no hope, no political fallout. He stepped forward, meeting her at the base of the stairs. The hall had grown unnervingly quiet as the guests sensed the shifting energy. "David?" Lisa breathed, her voice barely a whisper, meant only for him. Her eyes were shining with a profound, terrifying vulnerability. David looked down at her. He felt the bond trying to wrap around his heart, trying to sink its claws into his soul. He forced his face into a mask of cold, unyielding stone. "Step back, Lisa," he commanded, his voice carrying the harsh, commanding resonance of the Alpha King. The hopeful light in her eyes flickered. "What?" David squared his shoulders, ensuring his voice would carry to the listening elders, to Marcus, to the entire assembly. He would crush his own heart to protect his kingdom. "I, David Vance, Alpha King," he declared, the words slicing through the silence like a guillotine, "reject you, Lisa, as my mate." For a moment, the world stopped spinning. The music from the string quartet in the corner faltered and died out in a discordant scrape. Gasps rippled through the crowd of dignitaries. A rejection. The Alpha King had just publicly rejected his fated mate on the night of the winter solstice. It was unprecedented. It was brutal. David braced himself. He waited for the inevitable. The sobbing, the collapse, the desperate pleas. He had seen rejections before. The physical pain usually drove the rejected party to their knees. He hardened his heart, preparing to have his guards escort her away so she could heal in private. It was a necessary cruelty. But Lisa didn't fall. She stood perfectly still at the bottom of the stairs. The emerald silk of her dress barely trembled. The hopeful light in her hazel eyes hadn't just flickered out. It had been instantly replaced by an unreadable, flat calm. David frowned slightly, a sliver of confusion piercing his icy facade. Why wasn't she crying? Why wasn't she screaming at him? Lisa looked at him. She didn't look at his crown, or his broad shoulders, or the murmuring crowd behind him. She looked directly into his eyes, stripping away the title of king and seeing only the man who had just shattered her soul. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. David felt a bead of sweat form at the nape of his neck. "Say something," his wolf snarled at him, confused and deeply wounded by the severed bond. "Why isn't she fighting for us?" Lisa took a slow, deep breath. Her chest rose and fell evenly. Then she offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a bow of submission. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. "I accept your rejection, Alpha King," Lisa said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the hall, it carried perfectly. It was smooth, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. No tremor, no tears. Then she turned around. She didn't run. She didn't hike up her skirt to flee in humiliation. She simply walked back up the stairs, her steps measured and even, the same way she had come down. David stood frozen. He watched the sway of the emerald fabric, the straight line of her spine. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to reach out and grab her wrist, to pull her back and demand she react. He wanted her to show him the pain he knew he had inflicted, because this silence, this calm, collected departure, was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He had expected to break her. Instead, as the heavy oak doors at the top of the landing clicked quietly shut behind her, David felt a hairline fracture form in his own chest. Marcus stepped up beside him, his face pale. "David, what did you just do?" "What had to be done?" David snapped, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. He turned back to the crowd, forcing a tight, authoritative smile. "The music. Play." The quartet scrambled to resume their playing, but the festive atmosphere was dead. The elders watched him with narrowed, calculating eyes. They had wanted him to avoid a weak mate, yes, but the public brutality of it, and Lisa's chillingly stoic reaction, had unsettled them. David spent the rest of the evening making political small talk, discussing trade routes and border patrols. He accepted the fawning attention of Lady Genevieve, who seemed delighted by the turn of events. But he heard none of it. Every time there was a lull in the conversation, he heard the click of those oak doors. Every time he blinked, he saw the flat, empty look in Lisa's hazel eyes. He retreated to his study long before the gala ended. He poured himself a massive glass of bourbon and stood by the window, looking out over the snow-covered grounds. He had secured his kingdom. He had proven he was ruled by logic, not emotion. He had done the right thing for his people. So why did he feel like he had just made the greatest mistake of his life? His wolf whimpered, a pitiful, broken sound in the back of his mind. David pressed his forehead against the cold glass. She hadn't shed a single tear. And that, he realized with a sinking dread, was far more terrifying than if she had flooded the grand hall with her weeping. 3 days passed. The estate was humming with the fallout of the solstice gala. Whispers followed David down the corridors. The staff avoided his gaze. The Alpha King was ruthless, they murmured. Cold. David threw himself into his work, burying his growing unease under treaties and border dispute reports. He expected Lisa to leave. Usually, a rejected mate left the territory immediately, unable to bear the proximity. He had quietly instructed his head of security to ensure she had a generous severance and safe passage wherever she wished to go. On the 4th morning, David needed a specific historical precedent regarding a land dispute with the southern clans. "Get the head archivist," David barked at his assistant, a young beta named Thomas. "Sir." Thomas hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "The head archivist, Mr. Hayes, is on a mandated leave of absence. His daughter—" Thomas trailed off, realizing his mistake. David's head snapped up. "I know who his daughter is, Thomas. Where's the file?" "Lisa. Lisa has it, sir. She's the only one who knows the filing system for the old treaties." David felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. "She's still here?" "Yes, sir. She returned to work the morning after the gala." David stared at him. She hadn't left. She hadn't locked herself in a room to mourn. She had gone back to work. "Bring her here, with the file." 10 minutes later, a soft knock sounded at his heavy oak door. "Enter," David said, his voice tighter than he intended. Lisa walked in. She was wearing a simple, conservative gray skirt and a white blouse. Her hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked like a ghost of the woman in the emerald dress. She walked to his desk, her eyes fixed on the manila folder in her hands. She set it down precisely in the center of his blotter. The Treaty of 1842 regarding the southern borderlines, Alpha King, Lisa said. Her voice was the same as it had been on the stairs, polite, steady, and utterly empty. You didn't leave, David said. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Lisa finally looked up. Her hazel eyes met his. There was no pain, no anger, no longing. Just a blank, professional courtesy. My father's health is failing, Alpha King. His pension depends on his tenure here. As his assistant, I am fulfilling his duties until he recovers. I am needed in the archives. David felt a strange, cold panic rising in his chest. You are near me. The proximity, the severed bond, it should be causing you pain. It was causing him pain. A dull, constant ache behind his ribs that he was drinking too much scotch to ignore. I am managing, Alpha, Lisa replied smoothly. Is there anything else you require regarding the treaty? She was treating him like a boss, like a stranger. Lisa, David said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into an Alpha command without meaning to. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to flinch, to yell, to show him something to prove she was still human. Look at me. She looked at him, unblinking, serene. I am looking at you, Alpha King. David's hands curled into fists on his desk. He was a master tactician, a king who read people for a living. But looking at Lisa was like looking at a blank wall. He couldn't find a single crack in her armor. You may go, he gritted out. Thank you, Alpha King. She turned and left the room, her sensible heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. David stared at the closed door, long after she was gone. He opened the file she had brought. On the top page, written in the margins in neat, precise handwriting, were notes summarizing the exact points he needed for his meeting. She had anticipated his needs perfectly. She was efficient. She was brilliant. She was the mate he had thrown away because he thought she was weak. He leaned back in his leather chair, the silence of the room pressing in on him. She accepted his rejection without crying. She had absorbed the blow, internalized it, and walled herself off so completely that he couldn't reach her. He had wanted to sever the bond to maintain his control. But as he sat there, staring at her handwriting, the Alpha King realized that by not reacting, by offering him nothing but silence, Lisa had taken all the control for herself, and it was driving him absolutely insane. A week after the gala, the winter settled over the Obsidian Pack estate with a bitter, unforgiving freeze. Inside the Grand Council chamber, the atmosphere was equally frigid, though the massive hearth roared with fire. David sat at the head of the heavy oak table, staring at a topographical map of the northern wastes. Around him, his top generals and the prominent elders argued over supply chains. To his right sat Lady Genevieve. She had extended her visit, supposedly to aid in the negotiations, but her true purpose was painfully obvious to everyone in the room. She was laying claim to the empty space beside the king. Alpha, Genevieve purred, leaning closer. Her perfume, an overpowering blend of crushed roses and heavy musk, invaded his senses. If my father's soldiers are to patrol the perimeter, we will need a greater share of the silver mine yields. It is only fair. She placed a perfectly manicured hand over his forearm. A violent, visceral wave of nausea hit David. His wolf, usually a disciplined, dormant presence in his waking hours, violently recoiled. It snarled, pacing angrily against the confines of his mind. Not ours. get her away. David carefully, deliberately, pulled his arm out from under her touch. He did it smoothly, disguised as reaching for a ledger, but the slight tightening of Genevieve's lips told him she noticed the slight. "We will review the yields, Lady Genevieve," David said, his tone perfectly even, though a dull, throbbing ache pulsed behind his eyes. It was a persistent pain that had started the night he uttered the rejection. A quiet, steady punishment. Perhaps Elder Thorne, a man with a face like crumpled parchment and loyalty strictly tied to the Northern Alliance, said loudly, "We should formalize the ties between our packs sooner rather than later, Alpha. A king without a mate projects instability. The solstice proved you are willing to make difficult choices for the good of the pack. Now, you must make the right one." David's jaw clamped shut. He felt a phantom scent drift through his memory, vanilla and rain-soaked earth. He brutally shoved it down. "My marital status is not on the agenda today, Elder Thorne. The supply lines are." He abruptly stood up, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the stone floor. "We are at an impasse. We will reconvene at dawn. I need to consult the historical precedent on the Northern Silver Treaties." Before anyone could protest, David swept out of the room. He didn't wait for Marcus. He just needed to breathe air that didn't smell like roses and political maneuvering. Without consciously deciding to do so, his boots carried him down the winding stone staircases, deep into the belly of the estate. The archives were housed in the oldest part of the manor, a sprawling network of dimly lit aisles smelling of ancient parchment, binding glue, and dust. It was quiet here. A profound, heavy silence that felt entirely different from the oppressive tension upstairs. David walked down the central aisle, his footsteps muffled by the threadbare runner. He found her in the section dedicated to the border wars of the 18th century. Lisa was perched high on a rolling wooden ladder, her arms full of heavy, leather-bound tomes. She wore another conservative outfit, a dark navy sweater and a woolen skirt. A stray lock of dark hair had escaped her severe bun, falling across her cheek. David stopped, leaning against a bookshelf, hidden in the shadows. He simply watched her. Usually, the proximity of a rejected mate caused physical agony. The severed bond was an open wound that refused to clot. David felt the ache in his chest sharpen, a phantom hand squeezing his lungs. But he welcomed the pain. It was real. It was tangible. He watched as Lisa stretched to slide a book onto the top shelf. As she did, her breath hitched. Her hand trembled violently, and she rested her forehead against the wooden shelf, her eyes squeezing shut. A look of profound, agonizing pain washed over her features, breaking her mask of polite indifference. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the wood, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. She was suffering. The rejection was killing her from the inside out, but she was hiding it with terrifying discipline. David felt a brutal twist of guilt. He stepped out of the shadows. "Lisa." Her eyes flew open. The vulnerability vanished so quickly, it was as if a vault door had slammed shut. She straightened her spine, smoothing her skirt as she looked down at him. "Alpha King," she said, her voice a cool, flat stream of water. "I did not hear you approach." "The Northern Silver Treaties," David said, his voice raspy. He hated how defensive he sounded. "I need the records from the reign of Alpha Corvin." Lisa didn't say a word. She descended the ladder, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were carefully managing every muscle to prevent a tremor. She walked past him, keeping exactly 3 feet of distance between them, the precise circumference required to avoid brushing against his aura. She pulled a thick file from a lower cabinet, and turned to hand it to him. David reached for it. As he gripped the cardboard, his knuckles brushed against her fingers. A spark like a crack of static electricity snapped between them. Lisa flinched violently, ripping her hand back as if she had been burned. A tiny, involuntary gasp escaped her lips, and for a fraction of a second, her hazel eyes met his, swimming with raw, unfiltered agony. "I apologize," she whispered hastily, taking a step backward, wrapping her arms around her own waist. David stared at his hand. His skin tingled where they had touched, a desperate warmth fighting against the cold reality of his decree. "You're in pain," he said softly, the kingly facade dropping for a single moment. Lisa raised her chin. The mask slid perfectly back into place. "I am perfectly functional, Alpha. Is there anything else?" "Stop doing that," David snapped, a flare of anger rising in his chest. "Stop pretending it doesn't hurt. You're dying on your feet to protect a job." "I am protecting my father," Lisa corrected him, her tone icy and polite. "And I am respecting the decree of my king." "You severed the bond, Alpha. You do not get to demand access to my feelings now." She turned her back on him and walked back toward the ladder, her spine perfectly straight, leaving David standing alone in the dusty aisle, holding a file he no longer cared about, utterly defeated by her unbreakable composure. Sleep had become a foreign concept to David. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lisa gripping the bookshelf, enduring the phantom agony of his rejection in absolute silence. It was a torture of his own making. He had wanted a mate who wasn't a vulnerability. Instead, he had created an adversary whose greatest weapon was her profound apathy toward him. It was 3 a.m. The estate was cloaked in heavy, suffocating silence. David sat in his private study, a crystal glass of untouched bourbon sweating on his desk. He was staring at the file Lisa had handed him earlier that day. He flipped it open, intending to review the silver treaties before the council reconvened at dawn. As he read, his brow furrowed. The file was meticulously organized. But it wasn't just the historical records of the treaties. Inserted between the original parchments were pages of fresh, crisp paper, covered in Lisa's precise, elegant handwriting. They were analytical notes, cross-references. David leaned forward, his analytical mind engaging as he read her work. Lisa hadn't just been filing. She had been tracing a historical loophole. According to her meticulous diagrams, a land dispute settled 3 generations ago had a clause regarding subterranean mineral rights. A clause that Lady Genevieve's family, the current stewards of the northern wastes, had been quietly exploiting for decades. Lisa had mapped out the exact tonnage of silver that the Northern Pack had funneled away from the unified treasury. It was staggering. It bordered on treason. And Lady Genevieve was sitting upstairs, demanding more. David's heart pounded, a strange mix of fury at the betrayal and profound awe at the discovery. This was why Lisa was working so relentlessly. She wasn't just maintaining a pension. She was quietly safeguarding the financial stability of his entire kingdom from a dusty basement. She possessed a strategic intellect that rivaled his top generals. He closed the file. He couldn't wait until dawn. David strode out of his study, moving silently through the dark, sleeping corridors of the estate. He descended the stairs to the archives. A single golden sliver of light spilled from beneath the heavy wooden door. He pushed it open. The main desk in the center of the room was piled high with ledgers. Lisa was slumped forward over the desk, her head resting on her folded arms, fast asleep. A single desk lamp cast a warm halo over her dark hair. David stepped into the room, his movements terrifyingly quiet for a man of his size. He approached the desk, his eyes taking in the exhaustion etched into the pale lines of her face, even in sleep. The dark circles under her eyes were bruised and heavy. The bond sickness was draining her life force, yet she stayed. He looked down at the ledger beneath her arm. It was a current shipping manifest, cross-referenced with a tax document from 70 years ago. "Lisa," David said softly. She jerked awake instantly, a sharp intake of breath filling the quiet room. She scrambled backward, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. Disorientation flashed in her eyes for a millisecond before the familiar, impenetrable mask of polite indifference slammed down. "Alpha King," she said, quickly standing and smoothing her skirt. She didn't look at the clock. She simply accepted his presence at 3 in the morning as if it were a normal business appointment. "How may I assist you?" David tossed the file she had given him earlier onto the desk. "I read your notes on the Northern Silver Treaties." Lisa glanced at the file, her expression unreadable. "I hope they were helpful for your negotiations." "Helpful?" David let out a harsh, incredulous breath. "Lisa, you've uncovered a generational embezzlement scheme. Lady Genevieve's family has been stealing from the crown for 40 years. Thokar. They have been exploiting a vaguely worded addendum from the Treaty of 1902. Lisa corrected, her tone academic and detached. "Technically, it is not theft under the ancient laws, but it is a severe breach of the Modern Unification Pact. I assumed you would want the data before finalizing any new trade agreements with Lady Genevieve." David stared at her, the silence stretching between them. "Why didn't you bring this directly to me? I am an archivist, Alpha. My job is to organize the data. It is your job to act upon it." "You are brilliant," David said, the admission tearing its way out of his throat. He stepped closer to the desk, the physical pull of the bond roaring in his ears, begging him to touch her, to claim her. "You have a mind for strategy that this pact desperately needs. You are not just a commoner." Lisa's eyes hardened, a microscopic fracture in her composure. "Do not patronize me, David." It was the first time she had used his name since the stairs. It hit him like a physical blow. "You rejected me because I had no power, no political leverage." Lisa continued, her voice remaining quiet, though it now carried a razor-sharp edge. "You looked at me and saw liability. You do not get to praise me now because you realized I am useful. I am doing this for the pack, not for you." David gripped the edge of the desk. The pain in his chest was a living thing, clawing at his ribs. "How are you doing this, Lisa? The pain of the severed bond. It should be crippling you. It's crippling me." Lisa looked at him, her hazel eyes cold and clear. "You are an Alpha King, used to controlling everything," she whispered, the brutal honesty slicing through the quiet room. "You severed the bond to keep your control. I accepted it to keep mine. The pain is merely a consequence. I endure it because my father taught me how to work through the quiet." "Good night, Alpha." She turned off the desk lamp, plunging the room into shadows, leaving David standing in the dark, haunted by the brilliant, unbreakable woman he had thrown away. The great hall was flooded with the harsh, unforgiving light of the winter morning. The council table was fully assembled. David sat at the head, his face a mask of stone, betraying none of the sleepless night he had spent agonizing over his confrontation in the archives. To his left sat Marcus, taking notes. To his right, Lady Genevieve, looking radiant and utterly confident. Across the table, Elder Thorne cleared his throat, his ancient eyes fixed on David. In the corner of the room, seated at a small side table, was Lisa. She had been summoned to act as the official record keeper for the session, a duty usually performed by her father. She sat with perfect posture, her pen moving silently across the parchment, her face a serene, unreadable portrait. Alpha Vance, Elder Thorne began, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. We must finalize the northern perimeter defense. Lord Genevieve's father requires an answer regarding the increased silver yield allocation. We have reviewed the yields, Elder Thorne, David said, his voice deadly quiet. He didn't look at Genevieve. And we have found a discrepancy. Genevieve shifted slightly in her chair. A discrepancy, Alpha? A structural one, David replied. It appears the Northern Wastes have been misinterpreting the subterranean clauses of the 1902 treaty for several decades. A murmur rippled down the table. Elder Thorne's face darkened, a flush of angry red creeping up his neck. Misinterpreting. Alpha, those treaties are ancient and complex. I assure you the Northern Lords are acting entirely within their ancestral rights. Thorne's eyes darted around the room, looking for a target, and landed on the quiet woman in the corner. Who prepared this data? Thorne demanded, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Lisa. The archivist's daughter? Her father's mind is half gone with dementia, and we are trusting a commoner girl to interpret sovereign pack law? The room went dead silent. David felt a lethal, protective rage surge through his veins. His wolf clawed at the surface, demanding he tear out Thorne's throat for disrespecting their mate. He opened his mouth to shatter the elder's insolence, but a quiet, clear voice beat him to it. My father's mind is perfectly intact, Elder Thorne, Lisa said. Every head snapped toward her. She hadn't stopped writing. She didn't look angry. She looked merely observational. She set her pen down and finally looked up, meeting Thorne's furious glare with a gaze of chilling calm. The data is not an interpretation, Lisa continued, her voice carrying effortlessly across the large room. It is a mathematical certainty. If you review page 4 of the addendum, cross-referenced with the geographic fault lines mapped in 1914, you will find that the Northern Wastes have been claiming veins that fall entirely outside their ancestral borders. The total overage equates to roughly 300 pounds of pure silver annually. It is not an ancestral right, Elder. It is embezzlement. The hall erupted. Men shouted. Genevieve stood up, her face pale with shock and outrage. How dare you? She shrieked, dropping her aristocratic poise. You are a lowly clerk. Silence, David roared, his alpha aura exploding outward, pressing the air out of the room. The shouting instantly ceased. Several of the weaker men slumped in their chairs. David kept his eyes fixed on Lisa. She hadn't flinched at the noise, nor had she cowered under his aura. She simply sat there, having single-handedly detonated a political bomb with perfect, polite composure. The archivist is correct, David said coldly, turning his deadly gaze to Thorne. The evidence is irrefutable. There will be no increased yield. In fact, we will be discussing reparations for the stolen resources immediately. Thorne sputtered, opening his mouth to argue, but the look in David's eyes promised violence. The elder sank back into his chair, defeated. David felt a surge of dark, vindictive triumph. He looked back to the corner, wanting to share the victory with her, wanting to see a spark of pride in her eyes. Instead, he saw the color rapidly draining from Lisa's face. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, and the brutal reality of the severed bond was rushing back in to fill the void. The proximity to David, combined with the extreme stress, was finally too much for her fragile, disciplined system. Lisa stood up from her small table, swaying dangerously. She placed a hand on the edge of the wood to steady herself, her knuckles stark white. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. "Lisa," David said, his kingly facade instantly cracking. She took a step toward the door, but her knees buckled. David didn't think. He didn't care about the elders or Genevieve or his own decree. He vaulted over the corner of the heavy oak table, his boots hitting the stone floor with a loud crack, and sprinted toward her. He caught her just before she hit the ground, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. For a singular, blinding second, the physical contact sent a rush of pure, euphoric warmth through David's body. His wolf howled in relief. The pain in his chest vanished, replaced by the intoxicating scent of vanilla and rain. But the reaction from Lisa was violently different. Being touched by the mate who had officially rejected her was a toxic shock to her system. She gasped, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony tearing from her throat. Her eyes snapped open, wide and filled with terror. She shoved her hands against his chest with surprising, desperate strength. "Don't," she choked out, her voice raw and ragged, entirely stripped of its polite veneer. "Do not touch me, Alpha." She scrambled out of his arms, stumbling backward, looking at him not with anger, but with absolute, physical revulsion. David stood frozen, his hands empty, the euphoric warmth instantly replaced by a cold, devastating horror. In front of the entire council, the woman he had rejected was now physically repulsed by him. And as she turned and fled the great hall, her silence finally broken by the ragged sound of her breathing, David realized he hadn't just broken their bond. He had made himself a poison to her very soul. The heavy oak doors of the infirmary slammed shut, the sound echoing down the empty stone corridor like a gunshot. Inside, the air was thick with the sterile scent of rubbing alcohol, crushed wolfsbane, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. David paced the length of the small observation room like a caged predator. His charcoal suit jacket had been discarded hours ago, his tie ripped from his throat. His knuckles were bruised, the skin split from where he had punched the stone wall of the great hall after Lisa had fled from his touch. Through the thick glass window, he could see her. She lay on a narrow cot, her skin holding the terrifying translucence of spun glass. Her chest barely rose with each shallow, ragged breath. A heart monitor beeped beside her, the rhythm dangerously slow and erratic. Martha, the pack's ancient head healer, emerged from the sterilized room, pulling off a pair of latex gloves. Her face, mapped with a century of deep wrinkles, was set in a grim, unforgiving line. She did not bow to her king. "Tell me," David demanded, his voice a gravelly, desperate rasp. He stepped into her space, his alpha aura flaring uncontrollably, rattling the glass beakers on the nearby counters. Martha simply stared him down, entirely unbothered by his display of dominance. "Pull your power back, boy," she snapped, pointing a gnarled finger at his chest. "Your aura is exactly what is killing her." David froze. The breath hitched in his throat, and he forced the suffocating weight of his power back into his core. "What are you talking about? The severed bond is causing bond sickness. I know the texts. It causes pain, lethargy. Not this." He gestured wildly toward the glass. "When I touched her, she looked at me like I was a monster, like I was burning her alive." "You did burn her," Martha stated coldly. She walked over to a stainless steel basin and began washing her hands. Bond sickness is a mutual fading when a mate is rejected. It is a slow withering. But what you did on the stairs at the Solstice Gala was not a standard rejection, David. You used the full weight of your Alpha King command to sever the tie. David felt a cold sweat break out at the nape of his neck. She accepted it. She didn't fight me? Exactly. Martha turned to face him, wiping her hands on a towel. She didn't fight. She internalized your absolute command with zero resistance. She took your order to unmate her into the very core of her wolf. And because you are the reigning alpha, her system obeyed. Completely. So completely, in fact, that her immune system now registers you as a lethal, foreign pathogen. The words hit David with the force of a physical blow. His knees threatened to buckle. He reached out, gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. A pathogen? To her wolf, your scent, your touch, your very presence is a biological attack. Martha explained, her voice softening just a fraction as she saw the absolute devastation rip through the king. When you caught her in the Great Hall, her body went into toxic shock. You didn't just break her heart, David. You inverted her instincts. The man who was fated to be her safest harbor is now the most dangerous entity to her survival. David turned slowly to look through the glass again. Lisa's dark hair was plastered to her forehead with fever sweat. The woman who had quietly mapped the financial salvation of his kingdom from a dusty basement was dying, and he was the poison in her veins. How do I fix it? David whispered, the absolute vulnerability in his voice startling even himself. He wasn't a king negotiating a treaty. He was a terrified man begging for a miracle. I'll revoke the rejection. I'll announce her as Luna tonight. I'll do whatever it takes. Martha sighed, a heavy, sorrowful sound. You can't just take it back, Alpha. An Alpha's command, once accepted so deeply, cannot be unsaid with a simple change of mind. If you approach her now, if you try to force a mating mark or even hold her hand, the shock will stop her heart instantly. Then what do I do? David roared, the agony finally breaking through his stoic facade. You leave, Martha said firmly. You stay away from her so she can stabilize, and you pray to the moon goddess that her spirit is strong enough to survive the night. David stared at the healer, his chest heaving. The thought of walking away, of leaving her alone in that sterile room when all he wanted was to shield her, tore at his sanity. But as he looked at the erratic line on the heart monitor, he knew Martha was right. His presence was killing her. He turned on his heel and walked out of the infirmary, the silence of the corridor suffocating him. He had wanted a reign built on logic and unbreakable alliances. He had wanted to avoid vulnerability. But as he marched toward the council chambers, a lethal, icy calm settled over him. He was broken, yes, but he was still the king. And it was time to purge the rot from his kingdom. 20 minutes later, David kicked open the heavy oak doors of the council room. Lady Genevieve and Elder Thorne were mid-argument, but the sheer, oppressive violence radiating from David silenced the room instantly. Genevieve looked up, a haughty smile touching her lips. Alpha, we were just discussing the unfortunate incident with the archivist. I assure you, my father will be lenient regarding her slander, provided we secure the new silver yields. David walked slowly around the massive table. He didn't sit. He stopped directly behind Genevieve's chair, leaning down so his mouth was inches from her ear. He smelled the cloying scent of crushed roses, and it made him physically sick. Your father, David said, his voice a terrifying, vibrating purr that made the crystal glasses on the table rattle, will receive nothing. In fact, effective immediately, The northern wastes are stripped of their stewardship over the silver mines. Genevieve gasped, spinning in her chair to stare at him. You cannot do that. It is a breach of the Unification Pact. My father will march his armies on this estate. Let him march, David replied, his hazel eyes completely devoid of warmth. I will meet him at the border, and I will personally dismantle his pack piece by piece. The embezzlement ends today. The northern wastes will pay back every ounce of silver stolen over the last 40 years, or I will consider it an act of treason and wipe your bloodline from the map. Do you understand me, Genevieve? Elder Thorne sputtered, standing up. Alpha, this is madness. You are inviting war over the scribblings of a dying commoner. David's head snapped toward Thorne. That commoner, David snarled, his fangs dropping in a display of pure, unbridled primal rage, is the only reason you have a kingdom left to squabble over. You will refer to her with the respect she has earned, Elder, or I will remove your tongue. Thorne collapsed back into his chair, pale and trembling. Genevieve stared at David, finally realizing the terrible miscalculation she had made. The king wasn't looking for a political alliance anymore. He was a man with nothing left to lose. Pack your bags, Genevieve, David ordered, turning his back on her. You have 1 hour to vacate my territory. If I smell roses on my estate by nightfall, I will hunt you down myself. 2 days passed in agonizing slow motion. The Obsidian estate was transformed into a military fortress. Lady Genevieve had fled, and true to her word, her father, Lord Blackwood, had declared the Unification Pact broken. Word reached the estate that the northern armies were massing at the border, preparing to lay siege to the Central Territories. The council room was a chaotic mess of maps, troop deployments, and shouting generals. David stood at the head of the table, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw covered in a dark layer of stubble. He hadn't slept, he hadn't eaten. Every fiber of his being was stretched to the snapping point, divided between the impending war and the silent, agonizing wait for news from the infirmary. Marcus slammed a fist down on the map. They outnumber us on the eastern ridge, David. If Blackwood pushes through the valley, he cuts off our supply lines. We are going to bleed for this silver. Then we bleed, David said, his voice raw but unwavering. We do not yield to thieves. We hold the choke point at the river. If they want this estate, they will have to wade through their own dead to get it. The generals nodded grimly. It was a bleak strategy, a defensive stand that would cost hundreds of lives. But the Alpha King had spoken. Suddenly, the heavy doors of the council chamber creaked open. The arguing ceased. David looked up, annoyed by the interruption, but the words died in his throat. Standing in the doorway, supported heavily by the ancient pack healer, was Lisa. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. She wore a simple white linen gown, her frame painfully frail beneath the fabric. Her skin was the color of old parchment, and her dark hair hung limply around her shoulders. She was trembling violently, every breath a visible, agonizing effort. Yet her hazel eyes burned with a fierce, unyielding light. Under one arm, clutched tightly against her ribs, was a massive, leather-bound ledger. Lisa, David breathed. He took an instinctive step forward, the desperate urge to catch her overwhelming his logic. Stop, she gasped, raising a trembling hand. Do not come closer, Alpha. David froze, his boots glued to the stone floor. The reminder of his toxicity to her was a fresh knife in his gut. He watched in helpless agony as Martha guided Lisa to the nearest empty chair at the end of the long table. Lisa practically collapsed into the leather seat, panting as if she had just run a marathon. Elder Thorne sneered, though he kept his voice low. What is the meaning of this? This is a war council, not a hospice ward. Lisa didn't look at Thorne. She carefully, painstakingly hoisted the heavy ledger onto the polished oak table. Her fingers, thin and shaking, unclasped the brass lock. You are preparing to fight a war over the silver mines, Lisa said, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper that barely carried over the crackle of the fireplace. Yet, every man in the room strained to hear it. We are preparing to defend our borders, yes, Marcus answered gently, casting a worried glance at David. Lisa shook her head slightly, closing her eyes for a moment to gather her strength. You don't have to fight. You don't have to bleed. She opened the ledger to a page marked with a dried, pressed bluebell. The parchment was yellowed and brittle with age. My father. He couldn't remember his own name yesterday. Lisa murmured, a single, solitary tear finally escaping her stoic facade, tracing a wet path down her pale cheek. It was the first tear David had seen her shed, and it shattered whatever was left of his heart. But in his lucid moments, he remembered the archives. He remembered a blood pact. She pushed the massive book an inch forward. In 1874, Lisa continued, forcing the words out, Lord Blackwood's great-grandfather attempted a similar rebellion against the unified crown. He failed. To spare his bloodline from execution, he signed the vow of the Crimson Moon. David frowned, his tactical mind instantly engaging. The Crimson Vow? That's a myth. A ghost story elders tell pups to enforce loyalty. It is not a myth. Lisa breathed, tapping the fragile parchment. It is legally binding, sealed with alpha blood. The vow states that if any direct descendant of the Blackwood line raises arms against the unified crown unprovoked, the magic of the pact will instantly strip them of their alpha status. Their wolves will be severed from their spirits, leaving them as omegas. A stunned silence fell over the War Council. If this were true, it was a nuclear deterrent. No alpha would risk their wolf, their very identity, for silver. We didn't provoke them, Marcus stammered, reading the ancient script over Lisa's shoulder. We demanded stolen goods be returned. That is lawful justice, not an unprovoked attack. Exactly, Lisa whispered. She looked up, her gaze bypassing the generals, the elders, and finding David at the head of the table. Send a rider to the border. Send a copy of this pact under a flag of truce. Remind Lord Blackwood of the blood his ancestors spilled. If he steps 1 foot across the valley, he loses his wolf. The sheer brilliance of the maneuver left the room speechless. She had just dismantled an entire invading army with a single piece of paper. She had saved hundreds of lives without lifting a sword. You, David choked out, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had just done for a pack that had treated her like garbage. You saved us. Lisa offered a ghost of a smile, a tragic, hollow thing. I am an archivist, Alpha. It is my job to know the history. Suddenly, a violent shudder racked her frail body. The adrenaline that had propelled her to the council room evaporated in an instant. Lisa's eyes rolled back in her head, and she slumped sideways, sliding out of the heavy leather chair toward the unforgiving stone floor. Lisa, David roared. He didn't care about the pathogen. He didn't care about the rules. He sprinted the length of the table, diving to catch her before she hit the ground. The moment his hands clamped onto her shoulders, a horrific, agonized scream tore from Lisa's throat. Her body seized violently against him, her back arching as if she had been struck by lightning. The bond sickness, exacerbated by his direct physical touch, was triggering a massive, final, biological failure. "Martha!" David screamed, pulling Lisa against his chest, terrified by the heat radiating from her skin. "Martha, do something!" The old healer rushed forward, her face pale with genuine terror. "I told you not to touch her. You're killing her, David. Let her go." But David couldn't. He looked down at Lisa's face, watching the life rapidly draining from her hazel eyes, her breathing stopping entirely. He was holding his mate, his equal, his savior, and his touch was the blade ending her life. The Obsidian Pack estate entered a golden era of unprecedented peace. The northern wastes, terrified by the Crimson Vow, capitulated without a single casualty, paying heavy reparations that stabilized the unified territories for generations. David and Lisa ruled not as king and a decorative Luna, but as true equals. The elders quickly learned that while the Alpha King commanded the armies, the quiet woman in the library controlled the strategies, the ledgers, and the true power of the pack. They never fought a war again. Lisa proved that the most formidable weapon in a kingdom wasn't a roar or a set of claws, but the quiet, devastating power of a brilliant mind and an unbreakable spirit. And David, the ruthless tactician, learned that the only silence to fear is a world without her in it. Thank you for reading this story. If you enjoyed the emotional journey, the intense drama, and Lisa's quiet resilience, please consider leaving a like, sharing it with a fellow fiction lover, and subscribing for more immersive cinematic stories.